Hi there, this is Craig from Ottawa Swordplay, and I'm here with Matthew.
Hello.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of Fühlen and some extensions of Fühlen and some factors in using Fühlen that are maybe not very often talked about. And the first thing that we're going to do is talk about what Fühlen is. So Fühlen is a concept in Liechtenauer system of sword fighting, and it literally just means feeling. And the idea is that we can respond to things that we can feel faster than we can respond to things that we see. Human brain wiring for vision is not as good as we think it is. We depend on our vision for a lot of things, but our ability to respond to things we see is way slower than our ability to respond to things that we feel, to tactile stimulus. So Fühlen is basically that idea, and it's a thing that has been known to people who fight with weapons for a long time. And there's a whole bunch of things about Fühlen we could talk about. My interpretation of Liechtenauer, he really likes to use Fühlen. He likes to be at the bind because he's in contact, whereas Fiore, who I know much less about, seems to try and avoid the bind and doesn't seem to like Fühlen. And I think that that's because he doesn't want to give information, because one of the things about Fühlen is it's a two-way street. If I have Fühlen, then so does Matthew if we are in contact. So that is the most common thing, and it's fairly well known and fairly well understood, but there are a couple of other elements to Fühlen that I think are important that are maybe a little bit less explicit, and then there's some extensions on how other things we do affect our ability to use Fühlen. So the first thing is that in addition to being able to feel what's going on, there is an actual physical pressure involved in Fühlen. So we've got some quarterstaffs here, so we can use physical distancing while we're doing this, and also we don't really need to use masks for what we're about to demonstrate. But if Matthew and I have our staffs in contact on this side here, so I can feel, and scientific research has shown that humans using these kinds of things extend their physical or tactile perception through the tools that they have. Different materials transfer that information differently, but I can feel the pressure that Matthew is putting on here, which means that I can respond to that pressure fairly well. But there is another thing. If Matthew starts to push down on my quarterstaff, then if I use my lead hand as a fulcrum, I can use the pressure he's putting on to turn me through and maintain my safety and come in for something at the other end of the quarterstaff, or something like that. And definitely, if I'm pushing Matthew this way, he can take that movement and use it in a way that's useful to him. And this is really just again, kind of a simple idea where we're using the other person's impetus against us, which we hear a lot about in the context of things like judo and jiu-jitsu. But it's a little bit different with weapons because we're not as often actually throwing people, but we're using the impetus that they're giving us to direct our actions. The other thing that is a little bit tricky about Fühlen is that we don't always have it, but we can use the lack of Fühlen as a kind of Fühlen in some circumstances. So if I'm trying to throw a strike at Matthew and I'm expecting him to block, I can feel when that block happens, and I can now respond to that block with whatever I was going to do, because I've got that tactile information and the pressure may be guiding me somewhere. But if I throw that block I throw that strike and his block never comes, so he doesn't block, then once I've reached the point that I was expecting that Fühlen to be there, I should have a mental trigger, and this is not automatic, you have to train this, that tells me he is not doing that block, which means he is doing something else. And that may be dangerous for him, but it may be dangerous for me too. So I need to then take the fact that he hasn't made the block and turn it into a new action. This also ties, I'm going to say, with the first thing I said, which is that we're using the momentum. But in this case, if I'm doing a strike and Matthew is blocking, I'm using his momentum to come through to the other side. That's really common. If I'm doing my strike and there's suddenly no block there for me to take that energy, then I'm going to continue using the energy that I have to move in a new place. So that's a little bit of a different aspect where the Fhlen isn't there. That means something. We can recognize that and use it. All right, I've been talking a lot. The next part that we want to talk about is a little bit about how proprioception ties to Fhlen, and Matthew has a really good understanding of this, so I'm going to turn this over to him.
Yeah, so proprioception is, I guess, the modern or the scientific term for feeling. It's really, though, it's the feeling and it's the awareness of where we are in space, which is hugely important in a martial context. It's also really important in basic life. If I don't know where I am in space and I can't see well, I'm going to walk into walls and I'm going to, do things like that. So this awareness of where we are in space, that is a huge part of what Foolin is. And that ties into, so first of all, Craig talked about how science has shown that people that work with tools and weapons and so on extend our awareness of our bodies beyond ourselves. And one of the simple proprioception tests that is done in healthcare all the time is closing your eyes, trying to touch your fingertip to your nose. So if I can consistently do that 5 times in a row, then I'm going to, probably pass that portion of my post-concussion testing or whatever this testing might be. So a neat little trick. So if, you can always practice that at home yourself. And if you poke yourself in the eye, you need to work on your proprioception. So I can take my dagger, obviously I have a nice blunt one to be safe, close my eyes and see how accurately can I get. And with a little bit of work, I'm getting pretty good. And so 3 out of 5, I actually got the tip. So not bad at all, right? So that's the idea of what proprioception is. So that's important from a weapon point of view, because again, if I'm trying to hit Craig, I need to know where that tip is, right? So that ties into distance management. The other thing I'll throw in, for those of you that don't know me, is I do have a speech impediment, so I do stutter from time to time. So you just have to deal with that on your end of this. But yeah, so we need to know that awareness of where the weapon ends if we're going to be able to then actually contact the other person in the ring with it.
I do want to interrupt you and talk about that specific thing that you're doing. Not that, being able to touch yourself on the nose with a dagger is particularly in and of itself a useful skill if you're trying to fight me with a dagger. But it is an extension of your awareness. And it is a thing that you can train. And so one of the things that can improve your proprioception is to train this kind of thing. And if you're finding that you can't do it at all, well, first of all, you can slow it down. But the other thing is you can just try and be more aware of what you are feeling and do it with your eyes open and get used to it. And after you do it a few times, then close your eyes and see if you can repeat the action with your eyes closed. And you can do things like that to build up your ability to recognize where you are in space. And I will say, one of the things that makes training sword fighting really difficult is if you are unable to repeat physical actions and end up in the same place. And if you look at any of the stuff I've talked about being certain of your certain guard and stuff like that, being able to come into a position where you know where you are and you know that you have made yourself safe, it's really useful in a fight. And if you can't do that at all, it's more difficult to be good at sword fighting.
Yeah. And so not only can you train proprioception in terms of the hands and feet and, the things that Craig talked about, with the hands, you can do it with your feet as well, right? And so we have footwork drills. You can actually practice those with your eyes closed and find out, do you end up in the same spot, when you're doing it with the eyes closed, knowing what your own step length is. Again, that becomes really an important thing if in the context of any kind of competitive sword play or wrestling. If you know the outer edges of the ring, you want to know where you are in that ring at all times without actually having to look at those lines, right? We've got our red lines, yellow lines, but you want to be able to just know. And that kind of thing comes, for some people it will be much more innate, for others it won't, but you can improve it by training with your eyes closed. And that again goes a long way in that context.
Yeah, and that gets back to another thing that I often dwell on when I'm teaching people footwork and stuff. Well, and people often ask me, like, how big should their steps be? And the truth is they should be the size that you know what the size is, which is maybe not useful sounding, but we can vary the size of our steps. I generally prefer smaller steps to bigger steps for sword fighting for a bunch of reasons. But the truth is, if you can step consistently and know how far you're stepping every time, and your step happens to be a little bit bigger than my step or smaller than my step, that is more important, that you know how big it is and can do it consistently, because that helps you know where you are in space if you know how big your step is. There's no question about it.
The other part I'll throw in with that, so on, when we run our conditioning classes, one of the things I've said is when we're doing certain things like, say, a quadricep stretch, so standing on one leg, do a little demo, just your basic quad stretch, right? Doing this, right now I've got my eyes open, but if I close my eyes, suddenly I got to work a lot more, and you maybe can't see it from the camera there, but my foot is doing all kinds of movement back and forth. That kind of work is making my brain much more aware of every little movement that takes place. And so that, again, particularly from a wrestling point of view, will allow you to be much more agile on your feet, know where you are in the ring, know if you're, how to shift your balance back and forth. And so even if you don't have other people to practice with, you can improve your own Fooling or your own proprioception with that too.
So one of the other eyes closed training things that we do that is often tied to distance, because it's tied to our footwork, is just the idea of responding to changes in distancing appropriate. And it's really easy when we're sitting here in wheelie chairs that I'm talking about here. But if I am leading a drill for Matthew and I push him and he moves away on the wheelie chair, and I pull him and he moves towards me, well, that's pretty straightforward. But if we're standing up and Matthew has his eyes closed and we just keep like a nice bent flex in the thing here, he should be able to respond to the push and pull with his eyes closed fairly quickly and move back and forth. And there's a couple of aspects to this again. The first one is that he can feel the pressure that is coming through, and so that is a quick brain response thing. The second thing is that I'm pushing or pulling him in the direction that I want him to go, so he's using that force. But the third element that's there is that he is able to keep his weight centered and his body balanced so that he's actually able to move in either direction quickly. And while that's not specifically Fühlen or proprioception, well, knowing that you're in that position is part of proprioception, but it is an important element at being able to use those tools effectively. So it's kind of an extension of those. And distancing has a number of effects on how Fühlen works and how important it is. If I'm close enough that I can hit Matthew, then Fühlen is much more useful because I can actually hit him faster than he can respond to his visual cue, which I'm not going to do right now. But if I, tried to hit him with the stick, it would be very unlikely, unless he guessed right, that he would be able to respond to that in the kind of distance that we're talking about. So that is a place where if he has a weapon and there's sort of two possible things, the dagger's fine for now. Now the dagger's a little bit small for one of these, but if he can cover where the attack is going to come, then A, he's already covered, but he has to know where that is. So it's again awareness of where he's covered, where he's safe. But also if I have to go through or around his defense, that takes me more time, which gives him more time to respond. And that's not necessarily Fhlen, but it kind of is. And again, it ties into, if he sees this coming and I give him the pressure, he can now use the pressure to do whatever. And if he sees this coming and then I move around it and he doesn't get the pressure, he's got that no Fhlen cue that lets him respond. So there are ways to use Fhlen at that kind of distance, and it's really important. Now, if Matthew and I are back here, or this far apart, and whatever we have, and I can't hit Matthew unless I actually step into him, then he actually can visually respond to what he sees, which is super valuable, and it's important for him to know where the distance is, where that changes. So he needs to be able to recognize if I've come close enough that I can hit him without taking a step, that his response time is now no longer fast enough without some kind of Fhlen interference. And he needs to take steps to deal with that. So again, understanding and being aware of your overall distancing helps you be aware of when Fhlen is coming into play. Likewise, I am going to point out that there is a certain point of range where here, I can hit Matthew here, but I can't hit him low down, and I've got other videos where I talk about this kind of thing. So even though we're in range where he can't really respond 100% to what I'm doing, he knows that the options are limited, which means that he doesn't have to think as much about what I'm doing. So if I start to move, he can just cover where he's potentially threatened. So again, it's a little bit of an extension of Fhlen, and I guess that visual responses are useful until they stop being useful. And Fhlen is necessary except when it's not. Yeah. Anything else you want to say about that?
I think that's it.
All right. Well, I hope that was an interesting little discussion of Fhlen. I'd love to hear your opinions of it, so feel free to throw things in the comments, and we'll see you next video.
Cheers.